How's it going, everybody? You're sticking around on the Nest podcast. We're back. Just a couple announcements before we begin. The Nest podcast is back with some new improvements and features. Firstly, the Nest podcast will now be available across 4 different streaming services: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Podbean.com. Most uploads will now be running on an audio only to conserve time and promote consistency. Secondly, the Nest is introducing a new segment to the same channel called the Nest Politicast. Again, this will be found on the same channel. The episodes will include Politicast to the end of each title to separate regular Nest episodes from this one. This new segment will have a focus on local and national politics. And finally, looking ahead, we hope to set up a website to purchase official The Nest gear for anyone looking to support the growth and prosperity of this channel. Our new and improved logo will be printed on t-shirts, coasters, and more. And without further ado, let's get on with the show. So today, joining me is Jamie Tijerina. How's it going, Jamie?
It's going good. How are you? Thank you for having me once again. It's good to be back.
Jamie is a scientific researcher at Caltech, a budget advocate for disenfranchised communities in Los Angeles, and a current delegate for Assembly District 51, which incorporates East LA, Northeast LA, and the Chinatown District, and is now running for re-election. How's that going?
It's going well. It's just so ADEM elections tend to be whirlwind because it's a really, really short cycle, and it also happens during the holidays. So
I feel like that kind of caught us off guard because of all those things.
Yeah, totally. But it's always like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't even aware that there was elections going on until I saw you starting to post. And I was like, wait a minute, there's elections even after the presidential election? I didn't even know that was a thing. And
it's all party politics. And so the party is responsible for all the outreach, and in turn, the delegates are responsible for the outreach to let people know it's happening.
Right. And I always like to emphasize the fact that local politics are so critical to people living in any kind of community, because whatever happens in local politics is going to directly affect the community members in the area. So before people start thinking about who's going to be president or who's going to be any sort of national leader in the Senate or Congress, things like that, we should really focus more on the local politics. You know, who are people we are electing into the mayorship, into the city council, things of that nature. And in this case, we're dealing with you who is running for an assembly delegate, right? I want to give you the opportunity to let people know what an assembly delegate is, so that people are kind of aware of the position you're running for.
So the role I would take on is, first, you are required to attend the conventions that are held every year for the Democratic Party. And so this past time, because of the way that the election cycle was changed in California and that the primary was held in March, the 2 conventions were held in the same year. So that would have been 2019. One was held in June, right, just a few months after the election was finalized. And then the second one was held in November. So there was enough time between that and the primary. So that way the endorsements would, make a difference for those candidates.
One question I have for you is, amidst all the topics, all the issues going on in today's time, what are some of the positions or some of the things that you're advocating for, especially going into this kind of position of power? What kinds of things would you be advocating for once you get elected again?
So again, going back to what I mentioned about being the only delegate to endorse a specific candidate. So for me, I tend to focus on issues in the community that nobody's really looking at, but are seriously important. So one thing that's critical, that it has a little bit more traction to it, of course, and it's something that I genuinely feel strongly about, is making sure that we have equitable access to resources in the community. And that also means fair representation when it comes to things like historic preservation and cultural preservation. So I joined the Chicano Latino caucus, and so I'm aware of those issues because that's how I identify. And I also, on the ground, do my own work in the community as in a nonprofit board as president, and we're working on the nomination of the Chicano Arts Collectives of Highland Park for HCM status. And in doing that, I'm really trying to highlight the fact that we really need to be equitably preserving all culture in the community, and that we need to place an additional focus on preserving Chicano culture because there's a lot of politics behind it that make it specifically vulnerable. For example, our historic preservation overlay zones in the Highland Park Garvanza neighborhood, the period of significance ends at pretty much the beginning of the Chicano movement. And although these are local politics, again, going back to this and what you said earlier, this impacts who gets elected at the local level, because as a delegate, you have things that are important to you and that are important to the community. You're not just guessing. You have to understand the community and what they want. But you also have the ability to endorse and vote for the endorsement of who's going to get elected at the more local level. So, you focus on what's of interest and you make sure that reflects in what you're doing. So again, joining the Chicano Latino Caucus and focusing on that. Then I'm also part of the Arab American Caucus, which again, going back to things that people don't necessarily realize are an issue. We have a large Middle Eastern population in the community, and there's a lot of problem with not being able to quantify that because we don't have a Middle Eastern North African category on the census. And that's something that's been advocated for a very long time. And this past census, the 2020 census, the Trump administration rejected putting it on there, even though it had been recommended to do so this year, and it came very close to getting there. And what ends up happening is you have an entire segment of the population who you don't realize how many folks are identifying in that manner, and you don't know if they're experiencing some of the same health disparities and other lack of access to resources that our Latino communities are facing, for example. So bringing attention to that in the community, and that's a day-to-day thing. Going back to how I mentioned as part of the nonprofit, this is something that's a day-to-day thing. You bring it up in conversations, you let people know what's happening, and it's almost in a sense deep canvassing because you're having those one-on-one conversations to bring that awareness, kind of like what we're having right now. And then other things, like when there was the onset of the conflict between Armenia, Artsakh, and Azerbaijan, making sure that I mentioned to our local elected officials that there are people in the community in our district who specifically really care about that and specifically really want to see that our local elected officials in this area are taking a stance and actually seeing them and seeing that they care about this. And being a part of the Arab American Caucus is a way that I can demonstrate that this is an issue, but also use my own abilities and platform to speak out about it.
Why is it that there's like a lack of recognition of the fact that there is this population of Middle Eastern people living within certain segments of Los Angeles, including Assembly District 51? Is it because there's such a small population of people, or is it because, I don't know, what would you say is the reason why there's a lack of recognition?
So I think first of all, I think there's a little bit of confusion because some people might think that Middle Eastern populations identify as white, which is not necessarily accurate because socially and practically, they aren't viewed by, for example, people who identified as white always as white, right? And so I think there might be a little bit of confusion. I also think, and again, it could be discrimination, just straight up. I know there's a lot, especially after 9/11, there's been a lot of Islamophobia and a lot of stereotyping because, the people who perpetrated that act on the United States were from the Middle East, and unfortunately, people stereotype and generalize. So I think there's I think there's that going on, and I think it causes problems. We do have a pretty significant population of folks who are coming in as refugees from countries in the Middle East. And it may be that, unfortunately, people who are refugees don't necessarily have voting power at that point early on. And so there might be a lack of political power to be able to make the impact needed on the scale needed to really push the needle in a faster way on the issues, and then of course create that awareness about the issues so that they can get more people in the coalition, because there's people who feel very strongly about it, but when the awareness isn't there and the political power isn't there and there's confusion and there's discrimination and all of that together, I think creates a negative dynamic that causes folks to get marginalized.
Well, that's interesting because for the most part, you think about Northeast Los Angeles, or you think about East Los Angeles, or any parts of the area that Assembly District 51 encompasses. You don't really focus on the fact that there's Middle Eastern people living amongst us, because I'd say comfortably that most of the population that lives in this district is Chicano, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and there's no denying that that's a majority of the population. I mean, the in Northeast LA, the statistic I think I read the other day was 62%. It's over 60%. I think the concentration is mostly in Northeast LA, especially in Eagle Rock. Um, because it's right on the border of Glendale, where there's a major Armenian community. The other thing to note too is in terms of diaspora, there's a lot of folks who are Lebanese, and there's also a lot of folks who are Mexican and Lebanese. And that's a very common sort of combination. There's a lot of Lebanese diaspora in Mexico. And even just in passing conversations I've had, actually, when I was on the campaign trail, there was an interview I did, and it turned out the interviewer also had Lebanese roots. She was Mexican as well, like myself. I'm
Right.
Mexican, Guatemalan, Lebanese.
And
And so,
that's why I think you find yourself in a very particularly interesting situation running for this position, because you're, like you said, Middle Eastern, Mexican, and American, right? So you kind of
mhm.
encompass all three of these cultures, and I think that you'd be an effective candidate to bridge this gap.
Absolutely. And there's so many commonalities between the issues that these communities face. And there's so many commonalities in how, in terms of values and community values, family values, how cultural values, just the love of community and of one's family. I think there's so much in common, and then unfortunately also so much in common with some of the health disparities. There's high instances of diabetes in both communities. There are issues with representation in academia, for example, a lack of representation, very specifically in professor roles, in medical roles, in um, just places where you really need more people from both communities having the chance to represent and also serve, and be able to effectively serve with a cultural competence needed.
Right. I wanted to go back to something you mentioned earlier that you're advocating for, and that was the preservation of the Chicano um, culture.
So yes.
And I kind of just wanted to learn more about what you mean by preserve the Chicano culture. And do you mean in terms of artwork, or like the culture itself, or the people? What exactly did you mean by preserving the Chicano culture?
So I think actually all of the above. So in terms of what like I'm specifically working on right now, just in a practical sense, is we have a issue with the fact that a lot of historic buildings and places where very important events happened in our Chicano Latino communities that were led and started by Chicano Latinos themselves, um, are not being preserved. For one really good example is Roosevelt High School and the modernization project that occurred there.
All right.
So that was, I mean, we know in locally that was very controversial. There was a lot of groups advocating to preserve that space because it was a very important place in the Chicano movement where some very important things happened. And for students to be able to engage in learning in a historic place is such an opportunity for education, to be able to have the teacher say, not, this isn't just a regular place that you're learning, right? It's, of course, it's a school, but you're learning in a place where history was made, history
Right.
that means that you can get equal access to opportunities and education and have it be meaningful for you, that people advocated specifically for you as a Chicano Latino person who is growing up and coming up in these neighborhoods. So to have those symbols there and be able to learn within that environment is very important, for being able to appreciate the history and then being able to actually learn about it. And it's very difficult. It's not an easy process to get a historic cultural monument nomination. You really need to do a lot of research, and you often need a architectural historian or another professional who is an expert at doing that type of research to help you prepare the paperwork and the nomination to do that. And not many people are able or willing to put in that kind of work pro bono because it's very intensive. And so to expect those heavy lifts in communities that are struggling with survival, with accessing basic needs. These are trying to get a historic nomination when you have, when you're working for minimum wage and trying to put food on the table and raise your kids and make sure that they have everything they need. You're not going to be able to put in thousands of hours of research to do these things. And so what ends up happening is you have these historic places being, in the case of Roosevelt, demolished when
Right.
modernization could have happened still, while trying to find a way to preserve that space and that opportunity for learning in a space where something very important in Chicano history happened.
Kind
So
of
that
where I like to emphasize the significance of local politics because, like I said, at times people like to really focus on who's going to be the next president, and that's simply because the media uh, is largely responsible for putting out those kinds of things, right? It's the media who's shoving these news pieces in our faces, but at the local level, there's not a lot of media on these sorts of things that are happening on the local scale. And I think you're right. I think that students do need to find an ability to connect with historical landmarks, particularly when it has to do with their own education and their own history, especially as Chicanos. A lot of the Chicano movement started here in California, and more specifically in Southern California. And like you said, Roosevelt has had some important historical events occur in that building that was just demolished a short time ago.
Yeah, and being able to have local officials who realize that the nuance between preservation because a place is bona fide important versus preservations because you don't want a new thing.
Right.
It's a very different scenario. And so you have to make sure that you have people in power who recognize that and who also really understand how important all of that is. And that it's not just about buildings, it's so much more than that. And when you have people who have their hearts in the right place and have their minds in the right place of understanding it, these are people in local positions, right? And when you look also at people trying to have a resurgence or really an emergence, because I don't really think there's ever been a major third party, the local seats are winnable races. They're much more. You're not going to start at the top by winning president. I mean, yes, there's specific reasons why a third party does need to have a good showing for the presidential, and that's obviously pertaining to funding, access to funding to be able. It's a feedback loop. If you have a lack of funds, it's going to perpetuate itself, and if you have a lot of funds, it's going to make it easier to access more. And of course, in turn, in this context, access more support. So there's that. But then when you really come into enacting policy, it's really bottom up, not top down. So
right, it's just so crazy how almost every politician that gets elected into office has to choose between being a Democrat or a Republican. When I just feel like not every single person can identify concretely with either or. People are always kind of stuck in the middle. They identify as moderates and they kind of just have to choose with what most represents their ideas, but they can't really, they just have to kind of choose. They're put in a position where they just kind of have to choose. And I feel like that's a real loss to our system in terms of representing our opinions.
I agree, and I think it's challenging for individuals to, like, if there's something that they don't like or agree with the party. I mean, on the GOP side, there's a big, very obvious resurgence. Today's Holocaust Remembrance Day and the insurrection at the Capitol, there was some very, very anti-Semitic attire, which means that's what they think if they're wearing it on their bodies, worn by some of these folks. And obviously that's not what a majority of people feel and I would hope that that's not what the GOP stands for in reality. And so people are not going to want to identify themselves with a political party that accepts this kind of thing. That because anti-Semitism is not okay. It's just not. And to force people who identify as Jewish to make the choice, well, this party is doing this, but I only have one other option, and I don't identify fully with that either. What what do you do, right? So,
Right.
and that's just one example. There's, I'm sure, many, many more.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how, people sometimes find themselves struggling between choosing Republican or Democrat, and then they'll choose most of the time, especially in this community, um, a more democratic approach simply because they don't like that how the media portrays the Republican Party because of what a couple people do representing that party, like you said, that anti-Semitism stuff. Even though they'll support things like gun rights or things like that, but they won't lean towards republicanism because of the few outliers in there that are going to misrepresent the party. And the same can be said about the Democratic Party. I'm sure that there's been instances where the
Mhm.
Democratic Party isn't represented uh, to the best way possible, right?
Well, the other, I mean, on the other side of that, there's if we're gonna, again, since it's Holocaust Remembrance Day, um, looking at the controversy around the acceptance of BDS, that's something that's on the left. And many people feel really uncomfortable with BDS because they believe it's an anti-Semitic movement that
What's
is,
BDS?
that's the boycott, divest, sanctions movement that says that we need to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel because of the relationship that they have with the Palestinians and what's going on there. And to be honest, this is something I'm fully trying to understand because it's very complex. It's not, just like anything else. It's not, left or right, right? Like
Right.
what we're just trying to convey. It's a gray area, and we don't live there ourselves. Like we are
Right.
Americans who live in America, so we need to make sure that we understand what we're advocating for, that we understand what the movement is fully. And so some folks believe that this is singling out Israel for their foreign policy, and that there are other states who don't get, or states meaning other nations, that don't get singled out in the same way. And so and this is an anti-Semitic movement. So there's that aspect of it, and that's a lot of folks feel that they are not welcome in the progressive movement and on the left because of the acceptance of BDS. So that's another example. And so how do you handle these two situations when you only have two choices and you don't feel that you identify with them, right? Obviously, because the commonality they have is anti-Semitism, right? So
I've tried so hard to understand what was going on over there. I tried Googling and tried to find out what the whole deal was with the Palestinians and Israel and all that stuff, and I couldn't wrap my mind around what exactly the issue was, because a lot of it dates to historical events that occurred many years ago, and so I tried doing a deep dive, but it's just so complicated to try to understand.
well, it is because it's a lot, and it's like you said,
Yeah.
it's far back history. I mean, there's a lot of confusion about the meaning of what Zionism is, which is essentially that it's Jewish self-determination. So there's a school of thought that the creation of Israel is one of the most successful, actually the most successful, possibly, indigenous rights movement, in that Jewish people are in diaspora, but they were indigenous to Judea, and they've been able
Right.
to return to the ancestral lands. And Palestinians are also indigenous to Judea. However,
Right.
the issue is that the Romans conquered, and they created like Palestine. But it came historically in the timeline. It came after, but it doesn't mean that both populations don't have a tie ancestrally to the land. And so it gets very complicated. If you flash forward to the British Mandate of Palestine, I believe that that's where a lot of this conflict stemmed from. And again, I'm not an expert in this. I'm still trying to learn, just like you. And so, but that's how we get better and try and get things right, so that we're um, making sure that there's equity and there's fairness, and that we're not marginalizing people by trying to learn and get the story right. But I believe that the way that different powers had a role in splitting things up, I think it perpetuates the conflict, because there's a lot of people who make money on arms by not having peace there in that land. And I think
Right.
the people who lose in the end are the people who live there. They want, because ultimately nobody wants to be at forever war. That's just real. Nobody wants to be at war forever. People want peace. And that's why, it's important to remember we're learning and we don't live there. So we don't fully know what it's like to be on the ground. And so we can't impose our view from our standpoint and say this is this if we're not 100% sure about what's happening and we're not on the ground and we don't have to live with the consequences of
I
what
think
this
that
is.
there should definitely be a field of study for this, just for this topic alone,
Oh
because
yeah, and
this is
there's people who study this
something
in
that
much more depth.
I'm
Yeah,
sure.
we do the best we can.
Yeah, this isn't something you could just Google search, you get the answer with why
Mhm.
there's, all this conflict going on. Like you said, there's a lot of historical events that are attached to this, religious ideologies attached to all of this. And then on top of that, you throw the military industrial complex on in the mix.
Mhm.
It gets so complicated.
It's a lot,
Yeah,
but
so I definitely think there should be a field of study that researches this, and maybe that's the only way, we can find or begin to find a solution to that problem.
hmm but again, going back to the initial topic, like what's an example where people don't fit neatly into one category, left or right. Where are you? Where And you look, there's more parties. There's the choice of no party. You can pick no party
Oh yeah.
and be no party preference, literally. But the thing you lose is because we are in a de facto two-party system. Not that there's no other parties allowed to exist, but de facto, because you know two parties are at the top, and you will lose political power if you don't make a choice that you can live with and sleep at night.
Right, and so that's when you're canvassing, and doing all this political campaigning, most of what you're trying to do, as well as promoting your own candidacy, is to try to convert people that are non-partisan into joining your party, that being
Mm-hmm.
the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, because it's a huge win for the party to get people from a non-party position into a party affiliation.
hmm Well, that's why I think it's really important to be a big tent, right? I feel like it's such a cliche word because it's but it's the terminology that people understand because it's what's used. And so I think a lot of campaigning is not. I think to be somebody who is really service oriented for your community, you have to understand that when you run, you have a pretty good chance of losing. So winning should not be the only thing you want out of this. What you should be wanting to do is education, and that's voter education. And it is education that issues exist, education that people care about this, and education that you yourself have the ability to get involved and try and promote the issues that you care about and put them in the foreground if you get involved. And involvement is on a spectrum, right? There's people whose involvement is I vote. That's what I do. I vote every election, early, on time, vote by mail, however they do it, they do it. That's their level of involvement. And then there's other folks who might show up to community meetings and they get involved in that way. And they do it regularly. Other folks who might want to get on a nonprofit board. Other folks who might want to put their hat on the ring locally. Here in neighborhood council, there's town councils and other sorts of hierarchies elsewhere in other cities, but here it's the neighborhood council system. Some people are party politics, but your goal should be education. Whether you win or lose, it shouldn't be like, obviously politics and an election itself is zero sum, but the ideas should not be. The politics itself, the ideology is not zero sum, because the world is not one thing or the other. Most things exist in a gray area, not 100% of things, but a lot of things,
Well, that's
right?
interesting because I never saw it that way. I never saw it in that not only are you educating people, but you're also educating yourself in the process of campaigning.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time when you're campaigning, especially for someone that is a candidate that's most likely going to win, your main goal is to find strategies to win. And that
Mm-hmm.
being, getting the word out through leaflets or going
Of
canvassing or
course.
phone banking, all those things that are going to help you win the race. And I think that the perspective that you're providing right now on the fact that if you lose, as even if you lost, along the way you educated yourself and you educated people for a good cause.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very interesting perspective, and I never saw it that way.
Yeah, and the thing is, you have to, because the other piece too, it's a long game. It's the
Right.
majority of candidates don't win. That's it. Like, you can't just be in it for yourself and your ego. That ain't it. Like, that's not service. Like, that's just not service. I don't know. There's no other way to say that. But that's not serving, and you have to also understand that because of the issue of money in politics, a lot of voter education happens during an election, because that's when you can find the funding to do it. Because there are people who are motivated by the thing, right?
Yeah.
And the win. But you have to do the education. You have to hand the leaflets out. You have to add value, right? Like, so thinking about human-centered capitalism, right? It's about adding value. And people, you know what everybody hates? Those comments on Instagram posts where, like, follow my page. If you like this, follow, like,
Yeah.
buy my, whatever's. Like, nobody likes that stuff. That does not add value. That's like, like, do
Right.
you hit like on that? Do you like mark it as spam? Do you just like,
Right, because it
move
sounds
along,
so
scroll along?
self-centered and
Mhm.
not giving at all, right?
Yeah, and
Unless someone else stands to benefit or the entire community stands to benefit, right?
yeah, and the
That's
thing
when
is,
people are willing to share.
yeah, and you want to, and that's the thing, you want to add value genuinely and be authentic. And people are smart; they can tell when you are faking it and when something isn't real. Like one of those situations, those awkward buy my goods posts. No, nobody likes it because it's fake, it's awkward, it doesn't add value to your life. But if you are adding value to somebody's life, like you knocked on their door and they learned something new about their local politics,
Right.
that's
And
adding value.
that's why canvassing still stands as the most effective way to get your campaign out
Mm-hmm.
or to
Old school.
convince someone to want to vote for you, because you get that face-to-face interaction with people. You give them a feel of who you are as a character, as a person. People want to see who they're going to vote in. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's why it stands as still the most effective method of campaigning. When I was helping a campaign in Riverside, they
Mm-hmm.
really emphasized the canvassing, even though we weren't going to get to as many people as with phone banking.
Mm-hmm.
We knew that if we canvassed, we were going to get more votes from people because we were going to give them that feel for who they're voting for. Whereas if you're just calling them or texting them, people are going to be like, what is this phone call? What is this text? Yeah.
Next.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard because right now with COVID, canvassing isn't even safe to do.
Right.
But
And that's another
being
question I was
willing to
having. How is it that you even campaigned during COVID?
um I'll be honest, it feels like you are in an abyss to some extent. So because so right now everybody's focused on their screens, because it's really, you have people working remotely who are, I'm mostly actually can't work remotely. I would say it's like a 80-20, like 80 has to be in person because of the work I do is lab based. Of
Right.
course, there's scheduling people, there's the continuing education, a general administrative type stuff that you
Right.
can do from home, and you do what you can. But you can't run samples from your house. Like, it's not a thing. I'm not going to bring the
The whole lab.
$700,000 machine to my house. Like, that's just not even like no.
The whole
Just
Chrome laboratory.
yeah, like it's like, all right, moving van, here we go. No, that's just not a thing. And so but most people who can work remotely are on their screens. And then if everything's closed, what are you going to do? Scroll on your phone. You can't go to the store? Go on your phone, buy stuff on your phone, buy it online. You're on your phone. So a lot of campaigning in a COVID situation is really understanding technology, and then also understanding the folks who don't understand technology and how to reach them in a way that's safe for them, so that you can get to them, but also not make them sick and cause them harm. Because again, you're trying to help them genuinely because you care. That's why you're there. You're not there for yourself. Because to be honest, To campaign, if your only goal is just to win a seat, you it's very emotionally and physically draining and taxing when you run your whole family and friends group runs with you, even if they don't realize it. And you really like you are giving like a piece of your life, large chunks of your time. You have to really like in your heart care. You will not make it if you're just in it for yourself.
Right.
So you want to make sure you're reaching people, but not harming them, right?
Well,
And so,
it's kind of crazy how somebody like Trump ran for the highest seat in office, and I feel like that was the last thing on his mind. Caring about communities all across the nation. I think that the reason why he actually ran was because of the opposite, which was his ego, which is so interesting.
well, and look, he only won one term because
Right.
people see right through that shit. Excuse my French, but
It's
you
fine.
know, it is what it is. Like people are smart, and when they see that that person doesn't care about you, they're not gonna be like masochistic, right? Like we know the things that he has said and done and also not done in terms of, for example, pandemic control have
Right.
caused serious harm, especially if looking at communities of color and working class communities like ours. The Northeast and East Side have been decimated by COVID.
Well,
Decimated.
I kind of wanted to talk to you about that
Mm-hmm.
whole situation with, I mean, I guess you could call it COVID politics,
Mm-hmm.
um, and COVID control, like you said. Just recently, the LA superintendent, Austin Butner, um, says that schools can open once all the teachers have got vaccinated. And there's
Mm-hmm.
been major pushback from the teachers union in Los Angeles against this because
Mm-hmm.
they say, well, sure, we can get vaccinated, but is that really going to bring cases down? And also, should we open until cases have gone down? You know, what I kind of wanted to get your perspective on all this kind of stuff because obviously you're much smarter than me in all these topics and very well spoken. So I kind of wanted to pick your brain on what you think on this kind of stuff.
Well, it's so being a scientist, I'm going to be, you know, pragmatic and I'm not going to tell you like it's black and white, right? It's
All right.
again, just like everything else. And maybe it's because I complicate everything, but it is really the way you have to think, is that it's a gray area because there's so many variables, right? It's not just the teachers in the school. It's also the cafeteria workers. It's the custodians. At my workplace, we've had two people, staff members on campus, pass away because of COVID. One of them was working as a custodian, and the other one was working in physical plant. And we don't know the specifics, but we know what we know, which is that we've lost two people who matter to their families, who matter to the community, who matter to the people who work with them, who care for them, and we lost them. And so a school is not just only one type of employee, it's everybody. And then you have this challenge where you're trying to vaccinate everybody, but you don't have the access to the vaccine because you also have these tiers. But it's complicated because most people's jobs are essential. People wouldn't be getting paid for their labor if their labor didn't mean anything. Their labor matters; they matter. And so, when you have the teachers at risk, you have all of the support staff at risk, and then in turn you have the kids and their families because everybody once you meet with one person, you're not just meeting with them; you're meeting with everybody else who they've ever come in contact with. So if they had an exposure to COVID and they are shedding virus and you come in contact with them, like you're your host, like you're gonna get sick probably. And even if you don't get like physically symptomatic sick, you can come home and you have sensitive family members at home and you might spread the virus to them. And so COVID is no joke. Like every one of us is at least within 1 degree of separation of somebody who's passed. And that's the reality of it. When you start getting into the numbers that we're in, which I don't know the exact numbers because I'm not a machine, but I think it's like 400,000 people have died.
I
That's
think
not counting people who are permanently disabled by COVID, and are going to have lifelong effects that are not fully understood yet, and who are living it right now, and who are being studied for those experiences, so that way we can better understand it. We don't know what this outcome is going to be. So thinking about it in the short term, right? So I feel for those families who have kids who have to work, navigate teaching them from home. You're working from home possibly, or in person. Different family situations, different types of work means that your workplace is going to be, your work conditions are going to be different, but you still have to make sure your kids are learning what they need to learn on time. That's really hard. And of course, get your basic needs met. Basic hygiene, basic food, things like that. That's really hard. But if you think about it in terms of, okay, if I wait 6 more months, then I could potentially avoid a lifelong chronic illness. And if you change your perspective to like get out of the survival mode, which is I'm not, this is really easier said than done, because you have to and you need support. You need a support system to be able to do that. And a lot of people don't have that. So it's not easy. So it's like you get into mindset, well, let me think about this long term. But then the other challenge is a lot of people don't have the support systems needed to be able to do that. And so that's where this issue comes in, because I 100% see how those teachers feel, because they know it's not just them, it's everybody. And if they get sick, they have family who depends on them too. And if they pass away from this disease or are disabled as a result of it, or are going to have a chronic illness, then that's going to affect their whole family. And so they don't want to feel that their labor is more important than their humanity, right? And so they want to make sure that every precaution is taken and no stone is left unturned, and that they've had access to every possible thing that they could have access to prevent becoming sick with this disease and prevent infecting their families and also their students. But then you have the families who their kids need an education.
Well,
And
this problem becomes so complicated and so hard when you stand to consider the fact that a lot of these students are going to be missing out on 2.5 years of school time, on real legit school time, of being in a classroom, because the teachers union wants to push this until next year, because that's about when we'll start seeing COVID go away, right? With all these vaccinations that got to go out in different phases, right? First, the frontline workers get the COVID vaccine, and then you get people that are at risk, and then the general population, and then whoever else needs to get the vaccine. And these are all going to go out in phases, and it's going to take about this whole year to get all that stuff done. So the teachers union wants to push this into next year, meaning that it's going to be about two and a half years of school time since the last time any student has got a legit education from a school. And this is going to have very drastic long-term consequences in terms of their ability to learn at their grade level.
They'll get behind. And then you also have the issue, we don't have things like municipal broadband and access to internet universally. Right. So a lot of people aren't able to do some of those distance learning things. That's another piece of not having the support system that you need to be able to think in that long-term sense, because you do have to focus on that now. And that's why it's so hard. It's really, there's no solution where there isn't some kind of loss. And that's the really, really sad part. And going back to what we said, right? Trump didn't run for the people, he ran for himself. And we saw that. The people are smart. They saw that. They didn't reelect him. Because look at what it's doing to people on the ground, locally, day to day, their lives. The fact that we have to even have this conversation is due to mismanagement of the pandemic response. The fact that we just found out that there was no reserves as what promised for second doses, and now we're kind of stuck in by the limitations of the supply chain to be able to provide the solutions we need to get out of this quagmire. It's not simple.
And is that why we're currently looking at different companies to provide a COVID vaccine? Is it because one company alone can't provide the amount of vaccines needed to vaccinate the entire population? Or
I think there's that. And then I also think that everybody's different. Bodies are different. Body chemistry is different. People are going to react differently to different things. And so it is good to have multiple options. Again, looking at, different companies competing to make sure that we have things to choose from. The bad part about this is that we need to make sure that it's affordable for people, that people can actually access it, that it just doesn't exist just for the sake of existence. But yeah, so there's the issue of scale, how many people you can reach, but also Practically everybody's body chemistry is different, and they're going to react to different sorts of treatment. And also, different vaccines are going to have different mechanisms of action. And some people might respond better. You might get increased immunity because right now, I think Moderna is 94.1, percent effective after the second dose, and Pfizer is 95. So could we do better than that? Or could we have something where you only need to take one dose logistically? There's, it's creating options.
And there's different variations in what the vaccines will enable a person to not to do, but how it will enable them to become immune to this vaccine, right? So we talk in terms of getting a vaccine so we don't get it, but that's not really what the vaccine does, right? Because
it creates immunity, so that
I was reading on one of the contracts that people have to sign when they're about to get the vaccine, and the description says this vaccine will enable you to not get COVID. But is that really what each different vaccine does, or because you said that vaccines are different, right? Does it really mean that you're not going to get COVID with that vaccine, or does it mean that you're going to get less sick, or can it also mean that you have a less chance of spreading it? Because I know that vaccines are different.
It can mean any and all of the above, and there's still research being done to figure out some of these situations. So there's, of course, not developing the disease, right? There's that, and then there's not spreading it to other people. There's that aspect, but there's also reducing the severity if you do somehow develop the disease or the illness, despite being vaccinated. One of the things they're not sure about is whether you can be vaccinated and exposed to the virus, but not show symptoms, but also still be able to spread it. They're not sure about that. So there's, again, going back to what I said before, when you're a scientist, you have to you can't be absolute about everything, because there is always going to be like room for a possibility. We're still exploring the possibilities in that sense.
That's why it's so hard with this vaccine, because it's not like you get vaccinated and you could just go anywhere and party. It's because COVID can live inside your nostrils, right? And anytime you would sneeze, even though you have the immunity, you would still be in effect spreading the disease around to people that haven't got vaccinated, and that could potentially put them at risk. So it's not like once you have everybody vaccinated, everything's going to be fine, right? We have to kind of create this herd immunity where everyone's kind of immune, and the vaccine is just not in the picture anymore. And that takes a long time, right?
Yeah, and I forget the exact percentage required, but you need to make sure that people have the right information about the vaccine so that they actually get it. And there's a lot of issues with misinformation right now that are creating vaccine hesitancy. And that is really, unfortunately, even affecting healthcare professionals. There's a lot of vaccine hesitancy amongst healthcare professionals, and generally we rely on healthcare professionals to be able to do a lot of this education to the public. But there's been so many conspiracy theories and misinformation spread online. And of course, people are human. And so when you hear a story, oh, did you hear that happened to so-and-so? People get scared, even though it's anecdotal, and logically, you shouldn't allow yourself to be influenced by an outlier. But people kind of go with what they know, and they trust people they know, and they're like, well, so-and-so told me this happened to so-and-so, so I'm not going to take it now. And
you were actually one of the people that got lucky enough to get a vaccine this early, right?
Yeah, so I'm an ASCP certified laboratory professional, and we also work with labs that do some work with COVID, which means that I could have an indirect exposure to it. So that's how I was able to get access to the vaccine. But it was actually a process to find out who is even eligible for it, because the rollout to lab professionals with these certifications wasn't necessarily clear, especially if you're working in industry, for example. Some folks who go to labs that are running human samples, patient samples regularly, and are obviously going to be exposed to this, weren't sure if they were eligible when they clearly were. And so, again, going back to the spread of information, you have people who are 100% certain that they're eligible but don't want it because they're not getting the right information. Then you have people who are 100% eligible and they want it and they should be getting it, and they aren't getting the right information. It's not getting to them.
I want to ask you the first question I think that everybody has when they're considering taking or not taking the vaccine. Um, does it hurt? Because I know that
No,
the vaccine is like chilled at some preposterously cold level. So I just wanted to know if that kind of affects any way it's gonna hurt or feel. And also, is the needle like how long is the needle? How thick is it? I feel like these are all questions that people generally have about vaccines.
no. So I mean, I don't know the exact length of the needle or like the width, but it actually didn't hurt. Like I've had vaccines that hurt. Like thinking of vaccines that hurt, I've had the pneumonia vaccine that hurt, the tetanus shot that hurt, and it also had side effects for like a week with that. That sucked. But the COVID vaccine did not hurt. So they basically told me just relax your arm, like just relax it as much as possible, relax the muscle. Because if you don't relax, then yeah, it's going to hurt. So, and then she just kind of like massaged the area and then put the needle in. And I barely felt it. I was actually really surprised and it was over really fast. The pain that I did feel was actually afterward, which is a common side effect, is pain at the vaccine site
The
where
arm
the
soreness thing.
injection site. Yeah. And so like I didn't notice it right away. And then I went to go run an errand. And then I was at Target and I was like looking, oh, they have cast iron here. And I picked it up and I was like, oh, never mind. Like my arm. No, I'm not doing that today. And then the next morning I woke up and the pain was a little bit stronger. But then over the course of the day, it dissipated. And then the following day, it was very faint. And the day after that, it was gone. And it was like nothing. I know some people have had fatigue and headaches. I didn't have any of those things. I know there's other possible side effects, but at least that's not what I experienced. So yeah,
No fever, nothing like that. No
no,
body aches.
nothing. It was just the arm, basically this arm. And then, like I said, the progression of how it was, and I didn't have to like take off work or anything. It was fine.
And you got the Moderna vaccine, right?
I got the Moderna vaccine.
That's taken in 2 doses, meaning you have to take one. Say you take it today, in like 3 weeks, you have to get a second dose, and then you're completely immune, right?
So Moderna's 4 weeks, and then Pfizer is 3. Yeah.
Okay, so the Moderna one is 5 weeks. So I don't think you've taken the second one yet, right?
No. So yeah, in 4 weeks, 28 days, I have the second dose schedule. Actually, it's technically 30 days because that's just when I was able to get the appointment. But taking it like within plus or minus 4 days is fine. As far as that 28 day, they're still not fully sure. Because one of the concerns, like I was saying with the vaccine rollout and not being certain about the availability of second doses, if they go with this whole prioritize the first dose and then we'll see what happens with the second dose, like how long can you wait and have it still be effective and get the maximum effectiveness and benefit from having this. So again, I was fortunate in that I was able to get that second appointment in a timely manner. So yeah, and February 16th is my second dose and then I'll be finished. But I have heard, and to be determined, I will post this on my Instagram. I did the last time I did it on my IGTV just to kind of show people what the experience was like, and I'll do it again for the second one. But I have heard that the immune response could be stronger with the second one.
Really?
Again, yeah, I'm not 100% certain. Again, that's something I've heard anecdotally. So don't take it with a grain of salt. We'll see if anecdotally experience the same thing. I don't know, but I can't imagine that it's going to be that bad. So
whatever the result is, I'm probably going to share it on my story just so that people get a feel for, what people experience when they go through this process. Because I feel like it's really important to get a personal anecdote on the situation or getting the vaccine to get people to want to get vaccinated themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like right now there's not a lot of people who've got it. So there's not a lot of people who could say it's safe or that they feel like everybody should get it.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of people that know someone who got the vaccine already. So people are less inclined to want to get it themselves.
Yeah. And have you thought about, I know that in LA, there's folks who are waiting in lines or camping outside of healthcare facilities that are giving extra doses of the vaccine. Like if they have people who didn't show up for their appointments. Yeah. Have you thought about it?
I didn't know that. That's crazy.
Yeah. They've posted about it. And I want to say it was the LA Times, but in some of the news outlets that I follow online, I think it was LA Times. I just don't remember which one.
That sounds like a vaccine food bank or something.
Kinda, yeah. But people are they're doing it because, I mean, the other piece of this is we don't have enough vaccines. So it's a crime to have these go unused, because once you thaw them out, like they're basically a time
Oh,
bomb. You have to
right.
use
Yeah,
them
because you
within a
have to
certain
keep
period
them
of time.
cooled, right?
They
That's
have to be at
why
the temperature, which I
that's
don't remember
why
exactly. But
people would throw them out if they don't go to get their vaccine on their appointment date, right?
yeah, because
That's
if
crazy.
yeah, and there was I think it was in New York, they had a lot of doses going to waste because the penalties for these facilities, if they gave them to folks who were not scheduled to get them and got caught, were steep. So there was fines, I think, associated with it, and then also loss of privileges and access to be able to get future shipments. So instead of taking that, like the risk to like give away 8 doses was too high, so they would throw them out. And there's been speculation that places have been underreporting how much vaccine they've been discarding because it would cause outrage. Again, it's speculation, but in New York, it was reported on that this was happening because of some of the penalties associated with it. So
I feel like because there's not so much information on this stuff, not just the personal anecdotes, but also the effects it could have on children, because that's still not known, right? There's no information on how this vaccine potentially could impact someone that's below the age of 18, right? Because a lot of when you're looking through the information sheet on the vaccine, it says, um, or where it would say, which age groups can take this, it'll just say like children NA, or like children not known yet, because
because they haven't
there's
done enough
yeah, they
research
haven't
on
done
it.
enough research on that kind of stuff. And looking back at opening up schools, another one of the things that that the teacher union wants to push for is to have all the kids vaccinated, and that could potentially take who knows how long, because all this research has to come in. It probably might take over a year, right, to get all this information so that then we could start vaccinating the children.
Yeah, because they have to make sure they have enough folks participating in the studies, and also there are still unknowns about how the virus affects children. I know that I can't remember the name of the condition, but it manifests in a different way in kids and can cause mortality. It can cause death
Really?
in these kids. Yeah. So I think there's that aspect too, and trying to get a better understanding of that concern. So I mean, it's going to take time. I mean, research in general for to get a drug to market can take a very long time and can cost a lot of money, billions of dollars. And I mean, right now they've been able to do things faster because there's such a financial investment going into eradicating this. And I mean, obviously it's not going to be overnight that it's 100% eradicated, but having enough funding to do the research is going to make a difference. I mean, you remember the ice bucket challenge with ALS? I mean,
That was a while back, yeah.
that was a minute ago, yeah. But it took years to see the results of that. But the increased attention and funding actually did have tangible results and resulted in breakthroughs. And again, I'm not an expert on it, but it is something that did happen. What it does demonstrate is that research funding matters. And again, this goes back into our conversation about local politics. I feel that in general, scientific professionals and medical professionals don't have locally a lot of political power, and so that really impacts things on ways that people don't realize, because again, a lot of people have not met a scientist, PhD researcher. They aren't close friends with doctors. They haven't seen how the training, how they live during training times of it. A lot of people think PhD scientists are well off, not realizing that in most major cities, PhD postdocs qualify for HUD. And so that impacts who's going to be able to do that research, who goes into those fields. And then going back to something else we talked about, representation in high level positions that have decision-making power over what research gets done. And what communities and how that's executed. So there's all of these factors, and then the very specific one to COVID was the working conditions of the frontline medical professionals in the hospitals, in the ERs, the nursing staff in primary care facilities, their experiences with sort of being treated as not valuable because they weren't being given the proper PPE because there was shortages. The public being told, masks aren't effective, and then there being speculation around that being because they already knew there was going to be shortages. And I think the fact that a lot of scientific professionals and medical professionals don't have the bandwidth because their jobs are so demanding to get involved locally means that it's going to have implications down the road. That means their work conditions, prioritizing, making the supplies needed in an emergency situation like this, the issues with misinformation and bad rollouts or troubled rollouts of public health measures. That's because there's a lack of political power, and you don't have these people at the table making decisions or supporting the decisions being made in a more direct way.
I think this pandemic really highlighted the significance of having the scientific community closely attached to the political powers that be, because I feel like a lot of people sort of already assume that the scientific community is already closely attached to politics because of what a lot of Hollywood movies portray, right? Usually when there's like an apocalypse going on or there's some kind of zombie attack going on in the world, you always have a room with the president, the military, and then the scientists.
And they always ignore the scientists, low key. And then because of that, the disaster really gets bad.
But they always have the group of people who are actively figuring it out. They have the people in the lab coats that are like, all right, this is how we're gonna do it. But it's not really structured that way in the real world, right? It's always like, here's the political powers, and then the scientific community is just kind of on the sidelines, right? And then they kind of rely on these bigger companies like the FDA to provide a lot of this information, and that's where like all these political choices are made, and they're from looking at the bigger organizations, right? And they don't really have the scientific community at hand when they're making really important choices.
Yeah, and doing some of that, education on the ground, because again, it all goes back to what we talked about before, that it's not just about winning a thing, it's about educating, right? And so it's like, okay, well, we can't all be the congressman, or the congresswoman or the congress member. There's a finite number of them, and we can't all be it. Most people, there's always going to be millions more candidates than there are people who become elected officials. So it's like being willing to sort of understand what a role could look like, being involved in your community, and not realizing that, and realizing that being involved in politics doesn't mean that you're politicizing your science. It means that you're engaging and offering input, and you personally just have to work on maintaining your boundary, and making sure that the politics doesn't affect what you do and doesn't make you make bad decisions about what you do.
As a politician, I feel like many times they're put in a position where they have to make these tough choices, like whether they want to open schools or not.
You're never going to please everybody.
Right. There's always going to be a large group of people, or even a minority of people, that are going to be upset with any kind of choice that you make. Like most recently, LAUSD decided to make every student who has a grade of an F or a D to not complete. Meaning if you're a student who got an F in a particular course, or a D, meaning not a passing grade, that's automatically going to be converted to not complete or incomplete, so that you could fix that in the future. But the city councilman for this district, Kevin De Leon, wants to go even further and wants to make every F or D a passing grade. So say you have an F, he wants to make it at least a C. And so I feel like this is kind of a tough choice to make, especially when you're trying to measure people's academic strength, right? If you want to be able to categorize people at their level, at their grade level, and I feel like this would really upset a lot of people that worked really hard to get to where they're at, or going to college, things like that. Because if you're in high school and you get passing grades on all your courses, that's going to automatically grant you the ability to apply to colleges and get into colleges. So even if you have a failing grade somewhere in there, it's going to be automatically changed to a passing grade. So I kind of want to get your opinion on all this.
Well, it's hard because if you really think about how much of your life school is, like your primary education, your high school, high school is 4 years of your life, college is 4 years of your life
Right.
in the lifetime of 100 years. Okay, so the average life expectancy is closer to 80. But it's still really like, all right, let's just say high school and college, it's only 8 years. That's really only 10% of your life. And what if, people are not static over time, like they change, they grow, they evolve. And a grade can really like affect your life negatively if you were not in a good place during those, what are those formative years. Like it makes it very difficult to advance. Like say you decide later in life that you want to go to graduate school and you have bad grades because say you were in a hardship situation, you were in a pandemic and you didn't have internet access to get to your classes, your remote learning sessions, for example, and um, you did really poorly. And it wasn't because you suck, it's because you didn't have the access to the resources you need. And that could dog someone for the rest of their life and not really give them a chance to go back without having to pay tons of money into higher education and then get student loans and then get into debt and then not be able to get out of that debt till you retire or until it, until whenever, until
So do,
unknown periods of
so
time.
do
So
you think
there's,
that, that decision or that idea that Kevin De Leon, which is, by the way, the seat that he currently has was the seat that you were running for, right?
mhm.
Um, do you think
Well,
that choice that he, or that idea of converting every F and D into at least a C is a good one, or do you think it's a bad one, or what do you think?
I mean, I think I prefer this idea, the no credit option, I think is what you said, because I hadn't heard of this
Yeah,
yet.
the no
Um,
credit.
the no credit, I actually think that's a good opportunity because, all right, let me use an example of situations where being able to go back and redo something would actually be constructive and have a long-term impact and allow somebody to not end up in that situation where you're getting dogged for the rest of your life by a single bad grade or a few bad grades because of a bad snapshot in time in your life,
Right.
but still also going back and doing the work required and learning the thing that you needed to learn that you missed out on. Because if you didn't pass, it's because you missed out on something. Either the way it was presented wasn't meshing with how your mind works, or there was something externally that wasn't working for you. Like I said, maybe access to the resources you need to be able to access the information or do the studying that you need to do. So having the opportunity to go back and redo that work, I think is fair, um, because it doesn't really take away from the people who did it right the first time, or got the grade that they wanted or got the grade that they needed later. So like say they want to go to medical school later in life, the people who did well the first time around, they got to go and have and do their 4 years of high school, get all the A's, and then get into the college they want. They got all the A's, and then get into the med school they want, all the A's. They don't lose any time. But the people who have to redo the classes, um, they lose time, but they still gain the same knowledge as the person with the A's all throughout. So okay, this person did really bad in, like, let's say, okay, they got like mediocre grades in high school, and then they did really bad in, like, what would have been a semester's worth of coursework in college. And then they gave them a no credit, incomplete, and said, you have X amount of time to go back and fix this situation. So then they're like, you know what? I'm going to like get ahead. I'm going to make this right. I'm going to do good. I'm going to or do well and give myself another opportunity. So that what I was saying before, they lose time. Say they take a year to do that. They lose the time. So that other person is going to get into the workforce a whole year faster and make more money at a higher wage potential because they're going to have that graduate degree as an MD. Sure, maybe let's say it's a residency year and it's only like $60,000, $70,000. That's $60,000 or $70,000. But this other person is a year behind, so they're going to have that. They're losing that possibility, but what they're gaining is that opportunity to catch up. So that other person who made it through straight through, like, with all the A's all the time, no problem, they're not affected by this other person. They're not even going to be competing with each other because they're going to be in a completely different time frame.
Right.
That person who is behind might be competing with people behind them, but if those people are good enough to make it, they're going to make it. And if they want it bad enough, they're going to make it. And if they had the access to resources that they needed, they're going to make it. So No, sorry, what the NC. I think that's a much fairer opportunity because, people who have no business being upset about it, they're not going to have a reason to because that person is putting in the work, and the person who struggled is going to benefit too because they're going to get that knowledge that they missed out on because whatever they were dealing with at the time that they tried it the first time, and they may also save money, like what I said before. So using the med school example, right now the way it exists, there isn't that NC option for anything. So if you do poorly, you actually have to go to do something like a postbac, which is usually about 1 or 2 years of extra classes that cost about the same as a like a regular year's tuition. But they don't necessarily, depending on how you do it, if you're just doing a regular postbac, it doesn't confer you another degree that's going to give you any sort of earning potential. Say that you still don't get into med school following that, you're paying into the higher education system. And higher education is an investment, but it's not like the traditional investments like the stock market.
Right.
It's a high risk, high reward thing where the bet that you're placing is on yourself. And if something bad happens to you, like you yourself are the asset. So you have to believe in yourself and love yourself enough to know that you're going to make it and be willing to place that $60,000 bet on yourself, for 2 years of tuition and because you know that if you take that risk, you could do some great things. Right. And again, you can't, there are places where you have to look at the money, but it's not all about the money. When you go into medicine, it's like going into regular politics. You cannot do it just because you want a big paycheck. You will not make it. And it's taxing. There's so many stories about physician burnout right now because of what's happening with COVID, with healthcare worker burnout. Because if somebody goes into it just for like you're gonna burn out. That's because you don't feel it in your soul. Right.
And I feel like a lot of people emphasize the college education as this investment you're making in yourself. I hear that a lot by professors, by teachers, when you're going to go to college. Or when you're in college and say, this is an investment you're making in yourself. And I feel like a lot of people misinterpret that, like you're saying, as you're going to put this money in there and you're going to get this money out. But it's really not the case. You're just putting yourself in a much better position than if you hadn't done that. And then after that, after you graduate, it's really on you. And like you said, how much you want it, but also how the opportunities present themselves to you and what you do once those opportunities come your way. It's an investment in yourself, in that you're going to put yourself in a better position so that when you get the degree, you can do all sorts of things to increase the amount of income that you're going to be getting. But it's like you said, it's not like the traditional method, like the stock market, where you invest a certain amount of money and then you get a certain amount of money out.
Yeah. And so when going back to, if you put that $60,000 bet on yourself, the system, because there's no other recourse for you if you did bad in school, or if just things didn't turn out the way you needed them to, you have to pay, and you could end up in serious debt if even after you do all that stuff, the graduate school doesn't accept you, and you have to regroup. And so it's important to have an opportunity to redo things without forcing people to spend money in a system that's already broken. Because higher education with the student loans, like if something bad happens, you are still stuck paying those student loans. If something bad happens, you don't finish that program, you are still stuck paying those loans, and you'll have even less ability to pay them back if you didn't get the opportunities that you should have gotten had you been able to finish or been able to do it,
and
finish it the
way you like. That's why,
to.
And I'm not sure I don't think you've mentioned it in this podcast episode so far, but you're also advocating for student loan forgiveness, right? And reform, like you're saying. It's something that is definitely on your agenda. It has
to be both. Absolutely. And the thing is, student loan forgiveness, because a lot of loans, especially before there was the same magnifying glass that there is on it now, in the first recession, so I graduated at the height of that recession, and it was a really bad time. Like there, a lot of people who I knew and, graduated with these degrees, really smart people, really struggled in ways that wasn't what was advertised to us. And that in a sense, that's predatory. That's the definition of predatory lending, because it started to come out that statistics that these graduate schools and undergraduate programs were presenting about your futures if you attended their school were false. So if you're taking out a loan based on false pretenses, that's a predatory loan. That means that you might not have the ability to pay it back because you were fed false information. And in that sense, it's not a valid debt if you're fed false information to make that decision. And so in that case, then forgiveness is just because you were not told the full reality of what you were doing. You were making, in good faith, a decision to take out loans because you believed, again, that bet on yourself. You're like, I can do this. And I not only do I believe in myself, but I also believe this factual information that they're giving to me, or what you believe is factual in the way that they're presenting it to you. And I think I can do this. And I think that if this is a possibility that comes from here, and I'll be able to pay these back comfortably, I don't need to be a zillionaire, right? But like, I'll be able to survive and thrive in a reasonable way. And I'll be able to do this. And I think a lot of people, because that magnifying glass wasn't on there with those statistics, they were given false information and made decisions. And then when they got out, they realized, oh my God, this just happened. So I think in that sense, forgiveness absolutely is just, and it doesn't really take away from the people who paid them, because the people who paid them, it worked for them. This whole thing worked for them. It doesn't take, like, if I pay off, like I paid off one of them, like it was a tiny one. It was like, there was only like $500 left. But if somebody forgave somebody else's 10,000, it does not hurt me, because like I don't sting because they gave them and I paid my 500. And because I did get something out of it. It's not like, I spent 4 years and I came in and my head is empty. Like, I still did get something out of it. Right. And so like, I'm no me arde. It doesn't hurt me that I paid, and no me arde that somebody else got theirs forgiven. And again, going back to this zero-sum politics, it's a cancer. It's terrible. It's just because somebody wins doesn't mean I have to lose. Does not, like, the world doesn't actually work that way. Like if you look at the cooperation is how societies survive together. Ostracism used to be a death sentence because you are ostracized and you're alone. And but cooperation is how people. That's why no one wants to get ostracized, because they want to be participating, cooperating with others in order to be able to share resources. So forgiving debts that were made on false pretenses is absolutely just. And then reforming it so people can't get away with doing that. Like that, if you get caught doing that, and I low-key in an advisor meeting once, I was like, they asked me, did you go to this career fair? I said, yeah, I went, but there weren't a lot of employers there. And they're also only offering jobs in minimal areas, and right. the wages weren't that what you guys were citing here. So that seems weird to me. And you're saying that you have a 95% placement rate, or employment rate. I'm like, are those jobs that people already had coming in, or are they jobs they got through you guys' support? Because based on the support I'm getting, I don't feel that I'll be able to be part of that statistic from this program. She just stared at me, the advisor.
Jesus.
And I was like, and I was like, well, that's all I needed. I didn't need it. I didn't need it. The answer, the non-answer was the answer. And whatever the answer was, I got enough information,
That's
and that's okay. Tough. Like, you just let it go, and you're like, fine, I'm not going to leave here with an empty head. I got a good education, and I'm going to do the best I can with it. And if somebody else gets forgiven and I don't, I'm not mad.
That's such a good perspective that you had, because I feel like most of the time when you're a student, you're focused on completing an assignment, that you kind of forget that you're supposed to enjoy the process. You're supposed to love what you're learning, because that's the only way you're going to really be successful, is if you actually captivate the amount of knowledge that's coming in and love the process of doing it. You're supposed to enjoy academia. You're supposed to enjoy learning new things. And I feel like that's almost kind of lost today. I feel like people are constantly complaining about finals, or constantly complaining about midterms, or the next assignment they got to do, instead of focusing on actually learning the field that they're going into, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like I've said it before already. It's like you have to love it. If you're just motivated for money or motivated for ego, you're not gonna make it. You're just not, because most things that are worth doing, that's just not enough to keep the fire lit in your heart.
Exactly.
So,
Well, Jamie, I feel like we covered so many topics. I don't want to take away more.
Yeah, we did. No, we're not
literally
taking away no
cleared
time.
the
So
board.
we got time.
I just want to give you the chance to let people know anything you want to let them know before I end the show. I know that you're gonna. The last day you can turn in your ballot is February 3rd, right? So if anybody has a ballot at home sitting around, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there've been a lot of deadline changes and confusion because, so remember way back a little while ago, I was saying how these meetings used to be in person and they were 2 hours, and that was the only opportunity you had to vote for these things. Because of the pandemic changing everything, this is the first time it's ever been vote by mail. So the whole process has completely changed. And going back, it's separate voting system from the municipal, state, federal elections. So you had to register separately, and then they had to know to send you your ballot. There was obviously growing pains because it was the first time.
Right.
So there was, of course, as a result, delays in getting the ballots out, and still mail delays because of the issues that happened last year when DeJoy was leading USPS. And of course the volume of mail coming through because of the pandemic and people not being able to leave.
Right.
So there are still some mail delays happening. So the original deadline was absolute January 27th. Then they changed it to postmark January 27th. Must be received by February 3rd. So now the final change, your ballot must be received in hand by the party in either the, I think it's Van Nuys, and then somewhere up north is where the other ballots are being sent. And based on whatever region you live in, they'll have it sent there. But it needs to be in hand in either one of those locations by February 3rd. So you have to obviously put it in the mailbox before then. But if they've received it by February 3rd in hand, they will count it, and they will also send you an email letting you know that they've received your ballot. So you would have already had to have registered. I think it was originally, let me go back and look. So it was January 11th was the original deadline. Their website had a glitch, so they opened it up for 2 hours on January 12th. So if you didn't register by that point, you won't have gotten a ballot, but all the ballots should have been mailed out by now. So if you can vote in this election, you will have it. There's other assembly districts also that at pretty much everyone in California. So if you don't live in 51, you would have got a ballot for that district. I'm running on a slate called Communities United for 8051. So this is my squad. And I can, since this is going to be audio only, I can list all their names as well. The self-identified females are Susana Lopez, Teresa Montaño, Maggie Derek Quiroz, of course myself, Jamie Tijerina, Stephanie Maineto Jackson, Sarah Vascon, and Katrina Abrot. And then we have, for the other than self-identified females, we have Michael Contreras, Victor G. Sanchez, Luis Antonio Sanchez, Francis Engler, Vicente Gonzalez Reyes, John Galagli, and Alexander Del Campo. So that's my squad, Communities United for 8051. And then if you want more information about us, to read our candidate statements, you can visit our website, ad51united.com. To learn more about us. But if you live in Assembly District 51, I ask for your vote myself for re-election, Jamie Tijerina, and then of course my colleague Vicente Gonzalez Reyes on my squad. He's also running for re-election, and then the rest of my team who are going to be new delegates this year, as long as you vote for us. So, but yeah,
there it is.
That's what's up.
There it is.
Yeah.
All the stuff that you
left it on the dance floor.
Well, all the stuff you said today is really appreciated. I definitely will consider having you back because of the amount of wealth and knowledge that you can provide to this podcast and how well you're able to transmit it. So I definitely will consider having you back. You're super awesome. Thank you for sharing this time with me and talking all these topics that we talked about. And if you guys like the podcast, now I'm talking to the audience. If you guys like the podcast, make sure you guys subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. Again, there's more stuff that's gonna come out soon, and I will announce that via social media. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thanks again for having me.